Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Korea Society. Welcome to this policy program. I'm Stephen Noerper, Senior Director for Policy at the Korea Society. Delighted to have you all here today. And I'm especially delighted to welcome Jean Lee of the Woodrow Wilson Center, well known to many of you, an accomplished journalist and an accomplished program head now and a great thinker on Asia and on Korea. And so we're very excited to be able to sit today and to talk about something a bit different from the usual high policy issues that have concerned us. And while we maintain a lot of programming on priorities like denuclearization or human rights or the economic aspects around North Korea, we thought it an important time, especially with the US policy review underway, to talk about inter-Korean relations and to talk about the challenges, very frankly, of those and the current impasse, and to perhaps suggested opportunities on the inter-Korean relations front as we strive for Korean solutions to the Korean divide. So it has been a busy week. There has been a lot up and reported, especially in terms of recent comments by the Acting Assistant Secretary of State on US, Korea, Japan cooperation, concerns about North Korea and potential reprocessing. But today we will look at the inter-Korean relations aspect, and toward the end we will get into some of the larger regional issues as well and perspectives sometimes shared between the two Koreas on the powers around them. So let us turn to Jean Lee. Jean, welcome. It is great to have you here back at the Korea Society. You were here to talk with me about your opening of the bureau in Pyongyang for Associated Press. Very courageous, admirable, and I know you have a lot of fans watching and listening who appreciate your time doing that and your remarkable accomplishments since with the Woodrow Wilson Center. So welcome, nice to have you here, and why don't you open with a few reflections and we'll turn to conversation and then later on to Q&A, so send your questions to policy@koreasociety.org. Jean, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be with you. And I think it was a couple of years ago that we were at Columbia together. So a shout out to our favorite alma mater, Columbia. I wish we could be there in person, but it's great to be able to join you online as well. And as you mentioned, I have spent a lot of time both in South Korea and North Korea as a journalist, as a Korean American. My parents live in South Korea. And so what I want to do today is to hopefully bring you on the ground, both in South Korea and in North Korea, so that we can kind of humanize what these issues look like for the people of South Korea and North Korea, because we tend to look at these things as policy issues, rightly so. But I want to bring that very personal element into it so that you can really visualize what all of this means for the people on the ground as a Korean American who spent a lot of time in both those countries. So the first thing I want to talk about is the thing that really concerns me right now, which is North Korea's deepening isolation. I don't think I've seen North Korea as isolated as it is today. It's been more than a year since North Korea sealed its borders. And I think for us, that means things are very quiet. But I can assure you that the desperation is only deepening on the ground. And I think we should be mindful of the consequences of that isolation and that continued deprivation. And I am thinking about this because we saw these amazing pictures that the Russian Foreign Ministry put out last week. I'm sure some of you, those of you who are following North Korea, saw them. And it was this Russian diplomat pushing a wooden trolley with his family, and he has a 3-year-old sitting on board, all muffled up in their winter clothes, because February is brutally cold in North Korea, and especially in the far north. With their suitcases. And it was a more than 30-hour journey by train, and then by, I think by bus, and then the last bit of it for a kilometer or so, he just pushed them out of the country. And I think a lot of people treated it like a meme, and it's true. It looks like something out of something you would see in the 1800s, not 2021. But for me, I look at that and I think, what does this tell us about the hardship that not only foreigners are enduring in Pyongyang right now because of the border shutdowns, but also the North Koreans? I know from my own experience of spending time in North Korea for long stretches, it's very, very difficult. And I used to bring these massive suitcases, 3 of them, filled with everything I could possibly need. And I did have one instance where, and I would get sick, violently ill with stomach flu every single time. And I may have talked about this in the past Korea Society talk, but it was incredibly important for me to bring my own first aid and bring my own medicine. And the one time I forgot to do that, they could not find any antibiotics for me. And so this is the very basic reality of what life is like in North Korea, not only for the North Koreans, but for those of us who are also very privileged. And so I do think with it's been a year or so since those diplomats have been able to get in and out of the country. It's been many months since they've been able to get goods into the country. That is an extreme hardship. And so I look at that and think about it just helps to really make real what the suffering is like. The Russian ambassador did explain in an interview that shells are becoming more bare. And he mentioned something in the interview that I thought was interesting. They couldn't find shoes or clothes for their children. And that's something I hadn't thought of. But absolutely, things are becoming harder and harder to come by. And these are the things we're not seeing as more and more of the foreigners in this small community that I was part of leave. And that concerns me because it means we have less insight into what's happening on the ground. Foreign journalists, unfortunately, haven't been there for more than a year. God knows what's happening with that bureau that I set up. I do know that once you leave, it is very hard to get control and get back into the country again. So these are not decisions that foreigners make very lightly. They know the consequences. For us, I just do think about, the fact that it's very hard to get aid into the country as well. The WFP is saying that they might have to suspend operations because they just can't get aid into the country. And I think about the neediest North Koreans who were relying on those high protein biscuits that they provide and the other types of nutritional supplements. We already see the malnutrition I see it in the faces of the people of North Korea. And it's been generations now. What happens to generations of North Koreans when they're just not getting the nutrients that they need? And so this is something that we need to think about as for those of us who care about the well-being of the Korean people on both sides of the DMZ need to consider. I am just painting this picture because I just want you to remind you of what's at stake with the border shutdowns. Solution is going to have to be both short-term and long-term, but every move that we make, whether it's as a government or as the UN or as an NGO, needs to be thought through very carefully and strategically. And I know that this is going on right now when it comes to thinking about humanitarian aid. The challenge for South Korea and for the neighboring nations in the region is really, I think it has to be, how do we bring North Korea out of this isolation? How do we bring them into the international fold? But not only that, how do we encourage North Korea to act as as a responsible international member? How do we encourage them to abide by the principles that they agreed to when they joined the United Nations? And we need to think about these things because it's easier said than done. It's easier to say that, but North Korea has, when it comes down to it, relied on very illicit means as a way to get what it needs. And I think that they will do that more and more as it becomes harder for them to follow international rules. But that has to be part of the larger goal for South Korea, as well as for the neighbors in the region and for the United States. And identifying what those common interests are. And that includes China and Russia, for all of the neighbors to come together and really identify what their longer term strategy is. I think it's going to be really important. Now, North Korea is very good at driving a wedge among all of these neighbors. I call it the game of divide and conquer, and they use that to their advantage. And I always feel that it's kind of like parenting. I'm not a parent, but I hear that the whole idea of parenting, and you present a united front, so your child can't go to one and try to wrest some goodies from one of the parents. I think that not to reduce it to parenting, but I think this idea of establishing multilaterally what the common interests are, what the shared interests are for a long-term vision of how to not only deal with North Korea, but what kind of how we want North Korea to thrive. And how we want the Korean Peninsula to thrive needs to be part of the discussion. And so I think and I hope that the Biden administration which is currently undergoing, it was currently reviewing its Korea policy, is thinking about that as a strategy. I think that I just got back from South Korea. I was there for a few months, and I could sense the anxiety among government officials about a return potentially to strategic patience and a real impatience for movement on the US side to come up with that policy. Remember that President Moon only has a year left in office, and he's anxious to see some of his goals fulfilled before he leaves office. But I think, and I suspect, that this coming up with a cohesive, comprehensive strategy that does involve consultations with the neighbors is going to take some time. Now, I do think that we need to give North Korea some credit for exercising the restraint that they have been exercising when it comes to the testing of long-range ballistic missiles and nuclear devices. However, that doesn't mean they're not engaging in illicit activities. They are, and we should be mindful of that. That while things are quiet, trust me, they are working on that arsenal so that when the time comes for them to re-engage in nuclear negotiations, they'll be in a stronger position. And you mentioned that we've seen some nuclear activity. We've seen reports of nuclear activity, absolutely. I suspect that part of that is messaging. They know satellites are watching them. Part of it might be to put some pressure on Washington and to remind all of us that, hey, we're still looking at reprocessing. We're still building up that program. We haven't shut things down. But it is a good reminder that this program does not stop just because we're not inside North Korea and we're not seeing North Korea. I think that Kim Jong-un is waiting to see what his options are. But meanwhile, I think he's actively looking for ways to reduce his dependence on other countries. I do think that I'm seeing, I think the shelves are pretty bare because they can't get the materials in that they need, but they're really actively trying to find ways to make their own products so that they don't have to import them. And I also suspect that they are turning to ways to make money that we just can't see and that don't rely on the border shutdowns, and that's cyber. And this is something that I am very keenly interested in, and I think we need to pay closer attention to. Shall I keep going, or do you want to?
No. Let's jump into conversation. And you've
Great.
given us a very rich open there with a lot of issues. And to move then to the sort of the South Korean lens and the North-South relations lens, and given your emphasis on some of the humanitarian challenges posed in terms of foodstuffs, and you rightly note in terms of the danger of the World Food Program withdrawing and what that could mean. And in the face of that, then, why do you think North Korea is so resistant in pulling down those blinds to South Korean assistance in terms of South Korea's being able to offer that both from the government and the church and civil society angles, and in terms of South Korea's tremendous capacity on healthcare? And we've seen the initial responses around COVID and their expertise on that, now unrolling the vaccine. But to assist. And North Korea continues to hold that hand up, no. So how do you account for that beyond just the quest for legitimacy or pride? And how do we get out of that? Is there a way? Is there any opportunity to move forward?
I mean, it is political. Humanitarian aid should not be politicized, but I'll be honest, it's the North Koreans who do also politicize humanitarian aid. The time is not right for them. They see everything that they do as part of this master plan. Every step is carefully calculated, and that includes accepting aid. And so for them to engage South Korea, even to accept aid, would be a political move, and they are not ready to make that move. And so we need to recognize that. However, I do think there's opportunity, and South Korea should continue to look at what opportunity COVID presents, or the pandemic and the vaccine in particular. We have heard that the North Koreans should be receiving I think it's 1.7 million doses through COVAX. This is the WHO group that is working to get vaccines to underdeveloped countries. So is there an opportunity there? We know the North Koreans need and want vaccines. Is that an opportunity to engage them and draw them out of that isolation? President Moon of South Korea has also created a kind of regional public health and infectious diseases network. North Korea is not part of it. Mongolia is. And so that's a possibility that you could use some of these third countries that does have relationships with South Korea and North Korea to perhaps bring them to neutral territory to discuss ways that they could work together on this public health crisis in a way that isn't political. But I think we need to recognize, and this is again, it goes back to this game of divide and conquer and driving a wedge. I see North Korea, uses access as leverage, right? And when a country is not doing what it wants, particularly South Korea, it will seek to punish and sideline that country, and it will also seek to provide favor to another country in a way trying to create anxiety by the countries that are being sidelined and left out. I just think we need to recognize this dynamic, this tactic, and try to find a way to make it an untenable approach. So just recognizing that dynamic is important.
I'm encouraged, Jean, especially with your mention of Mongolia. And when I was with the U.S. State Department, Mongolia actually airlifted beef to North Korea, even though it was technically the poorest country in the region at that point in time. But it did that because of the floods in the east in the early 2000s. And it did that because of the historical relationship it enjoyed with North Korea. And of course, now Mongolia has vibrant relations with South Korea and has. So there is interesting opportunity there. And you're right, a bilateral offering and then something of a regional cooperation scheme provide a good opportunity if it's seized upon. Let's broaden our timeline back just a little in the sense that this is now 3 years since the Pyeongchang Games, since all that dramatic improvement and the symbolism around inter-Korean relations and the success of the Blue House in that regard. And of course, 3 meetings that year between the North and South Korean leaders. And now we stand back. There has been, the leaflet issue, the information issue that has dominated some of the headlines the last few months. And it seems that is a ways back. So how do you sort of look at that in a contemporary historical perspective? And is there a way that you think we get back to that with the Blue House currently in the next administration? And how do you think North Koreans, given your time on the ground in the DPRK, game that?
So there are a couple issues that you bring up. The Olympics, they were called the Peace Olympics. I did see that, I could see when I visited the North Korean ski resort, and I said back then in an interview that this is Kim Jong-un thinking ahead. And at the time, I don't know that anyone was thinking along the same lines, but I was in my head as I was skiing down those slopes, was thinking, this is Kim Jong-un seeking to find a way to use sports as a way to foster, to engage with South Korea and to be part of those Olympics. The approach he took was very different than the approach his father took. Kim Jong-il, and this is a very interesting history lesson, but Kim Jong-il, when Seoul hosted the 1988 Olympics, took a very different approach to make sure that he was on the radar. If you remember, he bombed that Korean airliner, and that was done in the months preceding the Seoul Olympics. So it was a very different way of making sure that North Korea wasn't left out of the discussion. So in that sense, I'm glad that the son is taking a different approach than the father, at least when it comes to sports diplomacy. So there's always potential. With sports diplomacy, I don't know, I think a lot of questions about the Tokyo Olympics are still up in the air, whether or not they're going to go forward as planned. Perhaps they'll go forward without spectators. But I am trying to pay attention to any rumors or discussion that there could be an opportunity to discuss, perhaps another joint Korean team, because this is another area that can perhaps avoid being politicized, and like some other issues we've talked about, could be somewhat neutral territory. I did follow the North Korean soccer team. I know you're a big soccer fan. So I followed them to South Africa for the 2010 World Cup Finals, and I still don't know is it the offsides rule? I know nothing about soccer. So I was clearly not there to write about soccer, but I was there to write about the politics around having the North Koreans at the World Cup Finals and the opportunity that it presented. To be honest, I used it as an opportunity to engage with the North Koreans because I was setting the stage to make this bid to open a bureau in North Korea. So I had my own ulterior motives, but it did make the North Koreans very aware of my presence because I was there with the team every single day. And they started to think I was somehow part of their delegation. But there is that potential not only to create a space for neutral territory, but also to bring North Koreans out. So is this another opportunity where you compel them to emerge from that isolation? That trip was so amazing in so many ways. Because I was able to, I'll just mention one experience. I was at, after the first game, which they did very well, it was against Brazil. And even though they lost, if I recall correctly, I think it was 2-1, but the North Koreans played very well. We all went to a restaurant in Johannesburg called Arirang, Korean restaurant. And it was, it was North Koreans, South Koreans, Korean Americans. It's just Koreans, right? So we had ethnic Koreans from Japan at one table. We had North Koreans at my table because I was minding the two North Korean journalists who were accompanying the team. And it was such an interesting moment where I was like, oh, actually, it doesn't matter what our passports are. We're at this international sporting event. We're all allowed to be here together. And my colleagues who were with me still tell stories about that day because I brought the two North Korean journalists back for champagne, and that was their first time trying brie because one of my colleagues brought some cheese from Switzerland. So, it does present that opportunity. And so that's something to think about as well, is there an opportunity for sports diplomacy? You mentioned, did you want to jump in? I know.
I'll just jump in with the fact that Moon Jae-in just this week mentioned that the Tokyo Games might well provide an opportunity too for US DPRK talks. And so interesting to think about the potential if those games do occur and what opportunity that provides for confidence building around the Korean Peninsula.
The leaflet ban, so the anti-leaflet ban goes into effect on March 30th. Highly controversial. I have had many disagreements with South Koreans and South Korean officials about this issue. And just a little bit of history. I mean, the leafletting is something, it's propaganda warfare that the North Koreans and the South Koreans had been engaging at the government level for many years. I will just tell you a story. So my family has land right at the DMZ. So my grandparents are buried there, and we go there regularly to pay our respects. And I do remember very clearly on one of those trips that my uncle picked up a leaflet that had been sent over from North Korea. And immediately, even before I could take a look at it, he brought it to the police and reported it to the police. But it was such a vivid reminder for me as an American that, this warfare is going on. It's this beautiful rural setting where my grandparents are buried. But it was just a reminder that just beyond this, that we are actually in this zone where war is going on. We sometimes forget that. Most people who visit South Korea don't go to the DMZ. I try to encourage everybody to go to the DMZ so they remember that this conflict has not been resolved and that it is this backdrop to all the tension that we're seeing with North Korea. So this leafleting, this is going on back and forth. The issue that I have with the South Korean law is that it doesn't make the distinction between government-sponsored and civilian leafleting. And I wish that they had clarified that language, because for the two governments to agree that they wouldn't engage in military-supported or government-supported propaganda, whether it's the broadcasts or leaflets, is one thing, but to stop civilians or restrict their ability to send leaflets across is a whole other issue. And on principle, I think we should be supporting the basic right for civilians to engage in that activity. I understand, there are 2.5 million South Koreans living across the DMZ, and for them, it might be a security issue. So there are a lot of complicating factors. And we've seen these issues when it comes to free speech and First Amendment in the United States versus national security. At Columbia Journalism, we studied this as well. Where do you draw the line? But I think that this is, as I mentioned earlier, as we think about the broader objective of bringing North Korea into the international fold and upholding those principles that they agreed to as a member of the United Nations, we also really have to stand firm on free speech. So I know that people will disagree with me, and we have many different ideas about this, but this is, I think, a really interesting issue, and we'll see what happens when the law goes into effect, because I do think that we will see some activists continuing to try to send leaflets on their own across the border.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with you. And most of the research in the scholarly community, does seem galvanized around the idea that freedom of information is critically important. And as we look at the latter years of the Soviet Union and other places of concern, and especially at a time where autocracy is on the rise elsewhere, right, Myanmar, et cetera. That free information and the promotion of that exchange and encouragement of civil society are so key. So you hit on a key issue. Can we jump into the beyond that into the cultural variant? Because there did seem to be some opportunity, again, going back 3 years, but and around the time of the Pyongyang Declaration, the K-pop opportunities, the other cultural exchange, and of course, from the South Korean perspective, the fascination and you wanted to talk crashing on too. Let's talk about the success of that series. Yeah, Crash Landing. The success of that series of Crash Landing onto you, and what that has meant in terms of popular perception, and what are the ground feelings about this, and an unlikely romance that captured a lot of popular imagination between a North Korean and a South Korean.
So I just wanted to, before we move on to Crash Landing, I did want to mention one thing, which is the one concern that I have about any encroachment on free speech or access to information is just that I worry about the continued criminalization of curiosity about North Korea. So the national security law in South Korea. So if you're in South Korea and you try to access anything related to any North Korean site, you'll get this kind of scary looking police warning saying you're violating law. I wonder what that does for young South Koreans who it's creating a lack of interest, I think, or a lack of curiosity because they can't access that information freely. I'm always surprised at how little South Koreans know about North Korea, even though South Korea is the country that we expect will know the most about North Korea. They have a shared language and a shared history. And yet, time and time again, my students from South Korea are less knowledgeable than my American students when it comes to North Korea. And so South Korea does need to think about how to prepare the next generation to deal with North Korea, think about North Korea, engage with North Korea. And so to criminalize or to further restrict free speech is not the way forward. It has to be, they have to be thinking about how they're going to get their younger generations to think about North Korea. I think it's, it's when young South Koreans have less connection and less interest in North Korea, I would say, than their parents and grandparents because they're so distant from it, both in terms of information and in terms of access. Now, on Crash Landing on You, that's why so I mentioned that as a prelude because I do think that show is really interesting. I will say that I watched the first episode in September. Now, for those of you, hopefully you've heard something about it if you're watching this talk and you're interested in all things Korea, but the premise is this, the daughter of this chaebol, daughter goes paragliding and something goes haywire with the wind and she ends up landing in North Korea, well, literally landing on a North Korean soldier. Very highly unlikely and very dangerous, so please don't try this at home. But it does. It's just an interesting drama in that it does it is supposed to be shot, right? It's supposed to take place in North Korea. What I loved about it was that it does provide these little kind of subtitles to explain things that South Koreans may not know because the languages are different. So one of the things, if you understand Korean, is it's so funny because that main character is speaking, she uses all this Konglish, she uses all this English in her daily language, and those North Koreans don't understand what she's saying. The Konglish is different in North Korea and South Korea. I know this because I had to learn the Konglish. It took me so much. I still get confused. I'd have to remember what the Konglish is in Seoul and then try to switch to the Konglish in Pyongyang as I was going back and forth. And I sometimes get it wrong. And I did one time use the wrong word for a cell phone in South Korea. And I heard the person whisper, "She must be a defector." So it's just that awareness that over 70 years of division means there's a difference in culture and a difference in language. But I was just going to say that it took me a long time. It's just so much of it is not accurate that it took me a long time to really get into it because it was a bit painful. Because I think they need to get this stuff right. I think even if it's entertainment, because it is one of the only views into North Korea that the South Koreans are allowed to see. It's a simple thing, but I don't know why in South Korean movies they always put the loyalty pin in the wrong place. It seems so basic. And so something as simple as that, I think, come on, can you just get this right? But that's just me griping. I have to say, I just finished it, and it's been giving me these dreams. I've just been dreaming about being back in North Korea from watching this series. And the dreams are so interesting because in some of them, in my dreams, I'm going back to a North Korea that kind of looks like what's happening in Crash Landing on You. And then I wake up and I'm just heartbroken because I know that that's not how North Korea is. And it's going to be a long time before it's that open, where you can move around that freely, where you can drive your own car as a foreigner, or people can't. So it's triggered all of these, dreams where I'm thinking maybe things have changed there. And then I wake up and I'm so depressed because I realize that they're portraying a world that doesn't exist and doesn't match the reality of how restrictive, how suffocating, and how harsh life can be, even in those very valuable moments of, humor and the very personal element that we get to see as well.
Well, Jean, does that mean that, at the heart of it, there's a real drift taking place and has taken place over 7 decades, and that especially with younger generation realities, there may be much more division, right, in the sociocultural way, and a much greater challenge to integration and reconciliation and reunification, all different things, right, and different parts and parcel of what will be a united Korean experience, if that happens. And does that mean that we see a two-state reality for a longer period, or does it create a challenge, or does common identity and the invocation of the Minjokuri make a difference and overcome that?
So this is complicated because I do think I mentioned a shared history, but the fact is the history that they teach the North Koreans is very different than the history that they teach the South Koreans. And so even on that very basic, when you say shared history, it's actually, they do have a shared history, but they have very different versions of that shared history. And so it illustrates just the depth of the challenge in thinking about how to reunify these two countries. I think Crash Landing also revealed to me how it is South Koreans see North Korea. I mean, they really, are often portraying them as these kind of simple-minded country bumpkins. And I find that to be so dangerous. No North Korean I met was simple-minded. They may have been poor, but they were just as clever and just as emotional and just as savvy as any South Korean. And so I think that if that attitude, it can persist, and I think it's reflected in how defectors say they're treated in South Korea as well, then we have a problem, right? We don't want to be looking at them as the underclass, so to speak. So I think that the fact is the economies of the two countries, it's the gap is so severe, and everything that comes along with it, including you sometimes see that very stark uh, picture or statistic of the difference in height between South Koreans and North Koreans. And even in my own lifetime, I used to be tall. I'm actually an average sized American. I used to be tall in South Korea, but I'm definitely not on the tall side anymore. But I am still tall in North Korea. When I step into an elevator, most of the men are shorter than me. So there's, it's not just in every sector, there's been this disparity. And as you said, when you have 70 years of a difference in language, difference in political thinking, yeah, it's the younger North Koreans that I meet and the younger South Koreans that I meet are less interested in one another than their grandparents. You have policy being written by the grandparents uh, uh, without a recognition or acknowledgement that their grandchildren and their grandchildren's children feel very differently about reunification. So I
Sure.
think these are some big challenges.
Indeed. Let's finish our conversation here before turning to the audience and questions with a question of a geopolitical variety. And the one country that both North and South Korea do not want crash landing on you is China. And so how do you think Koreans in South Korea and in North Korea are viewing China today, especially given U.S. concerns that are voiced and have a resonance in South Korea's own challenges relative to the pushback around THAAD deployment and economic punishment, and North Koreans, for all the dependency and the trade relationship, seem at least in quiet to voice a need to diversify away from China, right? They don't want to be seen as a Chinese vassal. So a commonality, but some differences. And how do you play the China question, North and South?
China, I mean, the rise of China is an issue that I spoke with South Koreans about quite a bit, especially in 2019. I think that we need to recognize as Americans that China is the big neighbor next door to Korea, and that they can't choose. The North Koreans and the South Koreans can't really choose one country or another when it comes to US-China strategic competition, because they have to live with China. South Korea obviously is very dependent when it comes to trade, and of course North Korea as well, because China is North Korea's lifeline, providing, before the border shut down, most of the trade that North Korea has come to rely upon. But I have to say, the sentiment is very similar in both North Korea and South Korea. When you talk to the average person or the average business person, they're not comfortable with that relationship. It makes them uneasy. They know that it's part of their reality, but they're trying to find ways to reduce their dependence on China, because along with that dependence comes the being beholden to Beijing in certain ways. So it was very interesting for me in North Korea, because we always portray China as the traditional ally of North Korea. But the resentment on the part of the North Koreans about having to be so reliant on China was palpable. And so that's very interesting. It was useful for me to recognize, because it does also suggest that we can't assume that North Korea is going to do everything China wants, that they have their own opinions and feelings toward China, and that they aren't as, I don't know if obedient is the right word, but they aren't as pliable as may wish. And so I think that that's something to recognize, that although they have this traditional relationship, it's an uneasy one, and it's been like that for centuries. And so I think that when it comes, though, to finding a strategy on North Korea, I do think the Biden administration has to figure out how it's going to work with China, even as it has this strategic competition with China for leadership in the region. But they've got to figure out and find some common ground with China when it comes to North Korea, and that is going to be for the benefit of everybody in the region, including North Korea.
Gene, thank you. And I'd like to turn now to questions from the audience. And for that, we have the Korea Society Policy Director, Jonathan Corrado. Jonathan, go ahead and put some questions to Gene.
Hi, Jonathan.
Thanks so
Make them
much.
easy.
Hey, Gene, how are you? Thank you so much for all your insights. Although I do have to complain that you rained on my plan to go hang gliding in the DMZ. So I'm a little upset about that. We were getting so many questions from our audience members. Thank you so much. Keep sending those in to policy@koreasociety.org. We have a lot. So feel free to go long, go short, however you feel like. And I'm going to abuse my prerogative as the moderator to ask the first question. There's a lot of reasons to be discouraged about inter-Korean relations right now. It's hard times. But as someone who has spent some time in both North Korea and South Korea, and one of the few people that has gone the other direction, because there's plenty of defectors, right? But there's not many people who have come from heavy experience in America and South Korea that then go on and get a chance to live in North Korea for a prolonged amount of time. I wonder what things you see that give you hope. And maybe I could prime the pump a little bit. Michelle Che Kim, one of our viewers, asked about family reunions. And I saw it recently popped up in the news that a new representative out in California, Young Kim, has put forward a bill proposing that Korean Americans get involved in these separated family reunions with their relatives in North Korea. They haven't been allowed to participate to date. So that was one thing that sort of gave me hope when I saw that. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the separated family reunions and just any other thing that kind of gives you a little bit of hope these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. We should remember that generation of Koreans who have been divided since the war is reaching an age where they may not ever be able to see their sisters, their children who are in North Korea. And so there's a sense of urgency there. I have family friends as well who have been reunited as Americans with their family in North Korea. And I was just talking about this the other day. One of my friends, and I don't know if she's watching now, but she went to North Korea to see her father left Kaesong as a boy. And I wrote about this for the AP in 2000. But her father left as a boy, and Kaesong's right on the border. So they sent him across the border thinking, it will just be a couple of weeks just for safety and he'll be okay. And then, of course, they shut that border down and he was never able to see his parents again. And he very quickly became, he ended up working for the US military, I think he said as a houseboy. So he was a boy at the time, he was a teenager at the time. And it's what I find so interesting is that people like him, their hometowns are in North Korea. So when they got to South Korea, it wasn't really home for them. He continued on to the United States. And so there are so many Korean Americans who actually, their families come from the North. And that's something that's really remarkable about our community. Our community in the United States. And so he actually went back as a doctor to North Korea and was able to see his younger sister, whom he hadn't seen since she was 6 years old. And I'll never forget what he said, which was that he saw her for the first time. She was 6 years old when he last saw her, and she was a white-haired elderly lady when he saw her again. And it's just, it's really, when you think about it on that personal level, that these are families who are separated. It's really emotional. So his daughter, my friend Leah, did go back to North Korea as a tourist and was able to meet her cousins. And she has this amazing photo of her with her first cousin, and they're side by side. You can see the family difference, but you just think, she doesn't speak any Korean. So you just think, God, it's just almost a matter of fate where we ended up. I ended up in America, but I could easily have been in North Korea. I think that the family reunions, you're right, it presents another opportunity. I did want to say, though, that like everything else, unfortunately, the North Koreans do tend to use it as a political move. And so when it's convenient and when it works for them, I see it sometimes as being emotional blackmail, because they know that these families in South Korea and in the United States desperately want to be reunited and that the time is tight. They can sometimes use it as emotional blackmail to get what they need. But I think that's, if we can use it as an opportunity, then that's fantastic, because there's a very personal story behind every one of these families that hasn't seen relatives that are in the North, and that includes my own.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that. I wanted to mention that Jerome Hoganson also asked a question similar to Stephen's last question about the cultural divide between North and South Korea, and whether that leads some, and you got into the generational dynamics here, to accept the division as permanent rather than seeking seeking out closer and warmer ties. So I just wanted to drop that in there and recognize our viewer, Jerome Hoganson, who seemed to anticipate.
Yes, Jerome, great question. Go ahead, Jonathan.
And then I want to ask a question from a viewer named Brian Gold at the University of Alberta, and I'll invite Stephen to jump in here as well, but perhaps we'll start with Jean. So he has an interesting question. He says, during the arduous march in the 1990s, the North Korean government at first denied for a long time the need for international aid, and then pivoted and opened up and said, we're ready for aid. So Brian wants to know if that kind of change might be in the air these days in terms of COVID relief.
Oh, that's a good question. I hope so. There has to be. So if you understand North Korean psychology, you also understand the intense sense of pride that they feel, that even though they're very poor, they're very, very proud. And that's something to keep in mind. They have a slightly different set of values, not slightly, a very different set of values than we do. But on the pride issue, South Koreans are very proud as well. And I see this as a trait that comes out of thousands of years of feeling like you're under attack and feeling like if you don't protect your national identity, you're just going to be absorbed by China or by Japan, right? So this sense of pride, there's a very real reason historically for it. And I always say that because I do think that with any of these efforts at outreach, it has to be a face-saving way. So if you've dealt with Asia, you know what a face-saving gesture is. And it's a way to kind of help them preserve their sense of pride. It's more than that when it comes to North Korea, because it means that you help them find a way to use it as propaganda. For me, dealing with the North Koreans when I was running the bureau, whenever I needed anything, and maybe I shouldn't be divulging my negotiation tactics, but I always had to find a way for my counterparts or my staff to kick it up higher and justify it in a face-saving way. So I always had to help them come up with a way to justify it, rationalize it, use it for their propaganda to their purposes, even though it's something I needed. And I think that's how we should be looking at how to position, whether it's vaccines or whether it's, I'm sorry, what was the other aspect that you mentioned? Vaccines as well as?
Just any kind of aid.
Aid. And so what happened, I think that the North Koreans, we may look back and think that they opened the doors, but I think it took it was a real difficult decision for the North Koreans to acknowledge and accept aid in the 1990s as well. But that was an incredibly dire situation. And if we do try to offer aid, it has to be perhaps positioned within that framework as well as how do we help them paint this in a way that works for their interests as well, if our commitment is really to get to the people who need it. And so that's just a little bit of strategy, understanding how they do things and the pressures that are on them, and to kind of make the case to the people who are above them. I think there's some agencies and some entities that have done this very well. Now, with North Korea, I suspect that they will be looking at characterizing this as development rather than help. So that's, again, a matter of pride. So they don't want to be seen as taking handouts. But so it's part of it might be messaging, and that might be an important way to look at it. It does raise difficult questions as well, because humanitarian aid is humanitarian aid, and there's a difference between aid and sustainable development. And there's some governments that will make the distinction. And so these are the kinds of issues we are looking at, that we need to be looking at. And we need to be considering the North Korean way of doing things so that we can reach them and sell it to them, so that they can sell it to their higher ups and convince the higher ups to let them allow that aid in.
Great. Thanks so much. And Stephen, any follow-on?
Yeah, I think Gene's absolutely right about the messaging aspect. And I've dealt with the North Koreans since 1994 when I was with the Nautilus Institute for Security and Sustainable Development. And we were engaged in energy as well as information issues and assistance. And in all the years of dealing with North Koreans and talking with them at the official level and unofficially, I would say that at the end of the day, beyond pandemics, they are pragmatic. And so trying to strike at the reality, because we can assume there is need there. I think we can fairly assume that there is COVID. And clearly it has been signaled through the Party Congress and some of the things since, including just yesterday with Kim Jong-un pointing to the issue of the community authorities and the provincial authorities as being responsible for the conduct of economic reform, that there is need. And if there is need, then the task is to find ways to provide that assistance constructively. But we need the ground staff. And with the withdrawal that Gene talked about, especially of UN personnel, it creates a real dilemma, right? And so things will have to be opened, some sort of sanctions reduction as part of a staggered approach, an encouragement for opening, as Gene has recommended, a communicating of assistance from South Korea, and hopefully a greater receptivity, because this is also can be seen as part of a larger process. How will the integration scheme go? And so there will need to be breaks in the ice in order to see larger development of Northern Korea and the care that is needed for the people of Northern Korea. And those are not, necessarily the regime people. It's the people outside Pyongyang who are no doubt suffering now.
Absolutely. And I did want to mention a phrase, principled engagement, principled diplomacy. So you and I are both members of the National Committee on North Korea, and this is a phrase we hear a lot. It's important, I think, that there is a risk to just handing things over to the North Koreans and letting them, so ideally, we would love to be able to hand aid over, hand goods over, hand the vaccines over. But there are strategic reasons why we can't just do that. And so it's important when you're looking at these issues to understand the consequences of the repercussions and the larger long-term strategy that aid groups and governments have when it comes to making sure that isn't a one-time thing, but it's an avenue for engagement and principled engagement in which you're looking at the long-term interests of North Korea, of the Korean Peninsula, of North Korea's place in Northeast Asia. And so it's a complicated issue. And I think that goes for sanctions as well. Again, if we look at the broader objective, sanctions are a diplomatic tool. In the short term, they are really hurting the North Korean people, but we need Kim Jong-un to make the strategic decision, not to hold his people hostage in that way, and not to make decisions that are harming their well-being. So
and this brings us to a great segue.
Issues.
Right, absolutely. And this is a good segue because I want to get to two more baskets of questions, get as many of our viewers' questions represented as possible. So the first basket of questions is about the relationship between denuclearization and inter-Korean relations. And then I'm going to get to a whole slew of questions on sanctions. Our viewers are very interested in that. But first, let's go to Jeffrey Tao's question. Jeffrey wants to know, is denuclearization an indispensable precondition for improvement in inter-Korean relations? So the simple way to say that is, do we need to denuke before we can start to get along between North and South Korea? Or, as you mentioned, does principled engagement open the opportunity for other avenues?
Listen, I don't think Kim Jong-un is going to give up his nuclear weapons entirely. That is just, he's put so much into them. He has had a long strategy. It's unfortunate that we let the program get as far as it did. That doesn't mean we accept that. And I think it's very complicated to acknowledge North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. But I think there's a lot we can do in the meantime to reduce the threat. And I think Vipin Narang at MIT said this recently at a panel where we both spoke, and he called it risk reduction. And I love that phrase because I think that's a very important way to look at it. But complete denuclearization, it should always be the goal. We should never let go of that ultimate goal. But if we want that at the start of the process, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve any kind of engagement. So I think, yeah, in terms of the Koreas, the thing that is the two Koreas, the thing that we have to recognize is that this goes back to the Korean War, and we need to do a little history lesson. Remember, the signatories of the armistice signed in 1953 were the United States and the UN on one side, and North Korea and China on the other. South Korea chose not to sign that agreement, the armistice. And so we just need to recognize that. On this other call this event where I was speaking, a former unification minister essentially, I think, insinuated that we Americans have no place in the discussion on how to deal with North Korea. And I would argue that while it is certainly an issue of self-determination among the Korean people, North and South, the fact is that the United States is part of this process because of the Korean War and still will need to have a role in those negotiations. And that the fact is, the North Koreans recognize that and tend to want to deal with the United States. I think all the parties need to make sure that South Korea is included, as South Korea is not sidelined. And that's why I advocate the multilateral approach rather than the one-on-one US-North Korea approach, which I think has sidelined South Korea. No, I'm going off base. Where were we? Did I answer?
Yes. And let's get to sanctions, because lots of our viewers are interested in this. And I'm going to sort of convey a bunch of their questions, but they all speak to the same theme. So I feel like you could sort of answer the aspects that you find compelling and worthy of address. So Hiho Cha asks a basic question: are sanctions working? And then my addition to that would be, should they be modified to facilitate inter-Korean and US DPRK relations? Next one is Gus Olson, who says, sort of takes the other approach: why doesn't the international community pressure China more to stop violating sanctions? And then Sean King, a senior VP at Park Strategies and at the University of Notre Dame, says, with the border closure happening right now, is now the time to see what sanctions can really do. So lots of different angles approaching the same issue. Sanctions, are they working? Should we change them?
It's a very complicated issue. And I do encourage, this is something that we would like to do more on at the Wilson Center, to try to explore these issues, because it's a real question about how sanctions are supposed to work. And remember, we have different types of sanctions. We have the sanctions issued by the US Treasury Department. We have the sanctions that have been issued by the UN Security Council. So there are many different types of sanctions, both bilateral and multilateral, and they have different intentions and different purposes. Again, I do see sanctions as, I want us to look at them as a diplomatic tool, and that there is a reason for how they are used now and how they will be used in the future. There are different purposes. I mean, some sanctions seek to really deprive or put a stranglehold on the way that North Korea gets money into the country to build the nuclear weapons. And some sanctions are just simply to try to pressure North Korea to make the right decisions. Do they work? I think that we can look at Hanoi, the summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. We saw that the lifting of the harshest of the UN Security Council sanctions was very high on his priority. So I think from that we can see that that is something that has really put a stranglehold on the North Korean economy. Now, China signed on to the sanctions in 2016, if I'm right, my memory serves, and that was very unusual. China doesn't usually sign on, usually does try to defend North Korean interests, but this was a signal that China was trying to send to North Korea that it had gone too far. But you also need China and other countries to be enforcing the sanctions for them to be effective. And China doesn't want North Korea to collapse. And so it's quite possible that there's some ways that they're trying to help North Korea get around those sanctions. Now, I will also say that, as I mentioned earlier, there is another way for North Korea to completely avoid this question, and that's cyber. There are very few there are very few borders in cyberspace. And so we may see North Korea, and I think we are seeing North Korea being more active and trying to find a way around sanctions and a way around the border closures. Sanctions should not be, we do not want sanctions to harm the daily lives of the North Korean people, and yet that is a consequence. And so that is also one of the things we need to be mindful of. And when you talk about, is there some way to adjust them? Absolutely. Is there some way to write them so that better serve the interests of the international community and what they're trying to do with the sanctions? And that discussion is going on. I hope that we'll start to see some really detailed ways to write the sanctions so that they focus on who it is they're trying to go after and do not do harm to the people who are really innocent bystanders in this.
Jean, thank you. And Jonathan, thank you very much for a rich set of questions. And it's important, I think we remember that sanctions are a tool. Sanctions are not a policy. And so we've heard from the Secretary of State that there is a menu that they're considering to include diplomatic engagement and broader issues that may be part of a more multi-staged approach and a more comprehensive approach. So let's hope that's the case. And of course, we hear from our South Korean colleagues that it is high time, at least in the Blue House and those in the government, that it is high time to adjust those. So we're sensitive to that. And Jean, thank you. It's been a really interesting hour. And you've given us a very detailed and frank assessment. And I think all of us, look ahead to the developments and hope that we get back to a better footing in terms of North-South relations, and that Pyongyang takes advantage of some of these offerings that have been put forward by Seoul. And your time is precious. We're very grateful to all of you who have joined. Thank you. We had 330 registrants today. There will be quite a few more listening and viewing afterwards. And to that end, I would like to thank our Director of IT, Peter Stemke. I'd like to thank our Director of Communications, Claire Callahan, and of course to our Policy Director, Jonathan Corrado, who did such a nice job with these questions and has played such a vital role for the Society. So to all of you, thank you. Please see koreasociety.org for membership and more. And please check out what's going on at the Wilson Center. To all our friends at Columbia University, thanks for your support. To my students there and to those at the Apex Studies Center and the Center for Korean Research and the Center for Korean Legal Studies at the Law School. And the Weatherhead East Asia Institute. We're most grateful. So, Jean, you are among, as an alum, good friends, and it's been great to have you at the Korea Society. We look forward to having you back, and we hope everyone joins us for the first Thursday in April, when we will talk about China-Korea relations more with Orville Schell and Yun Sun. So we'll see you back then. Jean Lee, thanks so much, and thank you all.
Thank you so much. It was a great hour.